Emmerdale teases that a storm is brewing in the shadows of the Dales, and at its center stands Robert Sugden, calculating, suspicious, and more determined than ever to expose the truth behind a man everyone else calls kind. Robert never believed in village sainthood. He knew the masks people wore, and no one wore his mask better than John. To the villagers, John was affable, dependable, the man who helped you fix a broken fence or offered to run errands for the elderly. But Robert had always been a man who trusted instincts over appearances, and something in John's perfectly composed demeanor didn't sit right with him. Behind the charitable smiles and neighborly concern, Robert suspected rot. And he was going to find it. The opportunity came when Robert stumbled across old documents tucked away in the digital files of the parish archives, files he wasn't supposed to access, but knew how to get to. Buried beneath budget reports and renovation permits was a document that didn't belong. A reference to an anonymous payment made around the time of the chain of deaths that had shaken Emmerdale not long ago. The payment had been to a private clinic, off the books, and most damning of all, it was traced to an account under John's name. It was a thread, and Robert was good at pulling. He didn't confront John immediately. Instead, he watched. 4 days. Studying John's movements, his routines, and especially his reactions when the topic of the village tragedies came up. Robert noted a flicker, barely perceptible, of discomfort every time the deaths were mentioned. Most people reacted with sadness. John flinched. That was enough. Robert orchestrated the meeting like a chess move. A casual suggestion to talk, under the guise of clearing old grudges. They met on neutral ground, behind the cricket pavilion, away from curious eyes. John was cautious from the start, guarded in a way that only confirmed Robert's suspicions. Why bring this up now? John asked, his voice measured. Robert smiled, not unkindly. Because I think you know more than you're letting on. He laid out the payment evidence casually, like tossing breadcrumbs. John's reaction wasn't rage. It was fear. His pupils narrowed, his posture stiffened, and he said nothing. Robert pressed on. You know what happened during that time, John. You were close to a few of the victims, weren't you? That was years ago, John said quietly. But it still keeps you up at night. It was then that Robert played his final card. He leaned forward slightly, his phone recording every word, and whispered, You didn't act alone, did you? John stood abruptly. You need to leave this alone. That's not how this works, Robert replied, sliding his phone back into his pocket. I'm not here to ask. I'm here to collect. The demand was clear, a large sum, transferred within 48 hours, or the recording would find its way into police hands, and maybe the local press. John didn't even argue. He only nodded, eyes dark and distant. Robert left the meeting satisfied. The game was in motion. But back at his flat, John's fists clenched so tightly his nails broke skin. He paced for hours, torn between fear and fury. The idea of being exposed ignited a terror that he hadn't felt since those nights, since the secrets began. He remembered how Owen had looked before it all ended, paranoid, impulsive, cornered. He remembered Nate, too, and how one whisper from the wrong person had sealed his fate. John hadn't killed them, but he'd watched it happen. He had stood at the edge of the fire while someone else lit the match. And now, Robert was kindling a flame of his own. The money was transferred the next morning. Silent compliance. But it didn't quiet Robert's ambition. Emboldened by the ease of it, he began hinting at a second payment. John saw it in his texts, innocuous on the surface, but laced with menace. Robert's arrogance was growing, and John knew it wouldn't stop. What made it worse was the smile. That damned smile when Robert passed him in the village square, a knowing nod as if to say, I own you now. John tried to seek counsel, but who could he turn to? The truth would bury him. Ronnie had suspicions already. A casual question about finances. A veiled inquiry from Rona about his changed behavior. The walls were closing in. And then the thoughts came, dark ones. What if Robert went the same way as the others? What if silence required sacrifice? John stood by the river one evening, staring into the black water. He pictured Robert's phone at the bottom, data corrupted, leverage gone. He imagined the gossip, the search, and finally, the acceptance. Robert had vanished. People would mourn. But eventually, they'd move on. But was John ready to do it? Could he? His hands shook as he lit a cigarette, watching the ripples break against the rocks. Robert had awakened something dormant in him. A cornered man becomes dangerous. And John, the charming, trustworthy, reliable John, was more cornered than he'd ever been in his life. John's thoughts were a storm of conflicting instincts, pride, panic, and the inescapable shame of having allowed himself to be manipulated. Ever since Robert's threat, he'd become like a man stalked by his own shadow, watching his back, monitoring every word he spoke, every look cast his way. The idea of anyone, especially Robert, having that kind of power over him clawed at his nerves. John knew that paying Robert off had only opened the door wider for further extortion. It would never end, not until Robert got everything he wanted or until John put an end to it himself. The temptation to mirror what had been done to Owen and Nate, eliminate the threat entirely, lingered dangerously at the edge of his mind. But John had changed, hadn't he? He told himself over and over that the darkness in him was a relic of the past, buried like a secret beneath layers of careful behavior and community goodwill. Still, Robert's arrival had unearthed it all, dragging his worst impulses back into the light. One evening, as dusk painted the village in bruised hues, John stood at the edge of the woods behind the farm, staring into the thicket where the silence seemed to conspire with him. It was the same place he and Nate had gone to settle things, where he'd crossed the line before. But this wasn't Nate. This was Robert. And Robert knew too much. Inside the village pub that night, Robert held court, with a smugness that grated on every nerve in John's body. He was flirting with a local woman, tossing back a pint like he hadn't a care in the world. Every gesture oozed confidence, the kind that came from knowing he had someone under his thumb. Ryan, sitting nearby, couldn't help but notice the tension flickering in John's clenched jaw as he entered. Ryan had always found Robert difficult to trust, and something about the way John and Robert exchanged glances made him suspicious. After Robert left, Ryan casually struck up conversation with John. "You all right? You've looked better." John forced a smile. "Just tired. Harvest season." But Ryan wasn't buying it. Later that night, he mentioned his concerns to Moira, who'd once had her own complicated history with both men. "Something's off," he told her. "Robert's walking around like he owns the place, and John's wound tighter than a wire fence." Moira agreed. She, too, had seen the shift. John had become erratic, missing appointments, snapping at workers, and keeping odd hours. It wasn't like him. Not anymore. Meanwhile, Robert continued to push. The recordings he had of their conversation weren't explosive on their own, but they hinted enough at wrongdoing to destroy John's image if edited cleverly or paired with further speculation. Robert demanded another payment. This time, he wanted a stake in the farm. John balked. "You've lost your mind," John growled when they met again in the barn, far from prying eyes. "I've found opportunity," Robert replied coolly. "You keep paying, or I start sharing." Simple choice. But it wasn't simple, not for John. He didn't just fear for his reputation. He feared what might happen if he was pushed too far. One night, The strain overwhelmed him. He drove out to a remote quarry, stood near the edge, and screamed into the dark. He imagined pushing Robert in. He imagined the relief. But it was only a fantasy, one he couldn't act on without losing himself completely. Instead, he decided to fight smarter. John began his own digging. He started speaking to people Robert had wronged in the past. Former lovers, estranged family, angry business contacts. Piece by piece, he collected his own insurance policy. Then came the break. A former associate of Robert's, someone who'd been conned out of money in a dodgy property scheme, shared damning documents with John. Fraud, falsified invoices, money laundered through ghost accounts. With the evidence in hand, John confronted Robert. "Call off your game, or I go to the police. This time it's your neck on the line." Robert's smile faltered. "You wouldn't dare. Try me." There was a beat of silence where neither moved, the tension coiled between them like a lit fuse. Finally, Robert sneered and backed off. He knew when he was cornered. But the damage had already rippled outward. Ryan, following his instincts, uncovered the initial blackmail scheme. Furious that John hadn't come forward, he confronted him at the pub. "You let him play you like a fiddle while we all believed you were someone to trust. I had to protect everything I built." John shot back. "The village, the farm. Moira. If that tape had gone public." "It's not about the tape." Ryan barked. "It's about honesty." Moira, heartbroken by the revelation, retreated from John emotionally. She didn't know what hurt more, the fact that he had secrets, or the fact that he still didn't know how to ask for help. Robert, humiliated and cornered, left the village, but not before leaving a final message: "This isn't over." John stood at the window of his farmhouse that night, watching the lights of the village flicker like distant stars. He had survived the storm, but the landscape had changed. Relationships had shifted. Trust had cracked. He wondered if it was over. Truly. Or if the darkness in him, once stirred, could ever really be put back to sleep.